Shangguan, written upon imperial command on early spring in Guiling Hall. A sedan chair emerges from the Xiang Palace. A clear song draws near to the Taiye pond. Morning trees are filled with warbling orioles. Spring banks are strewn with fragrant grasses. The scenery reflected in the luster of the dewdrops. Petals of snow rise up to the azure void. Colorful butterflies appear without end. The mountain's glow dims with the approaching sunset. Okay, so this is a poem by Shangguan, and you've already heard his name being quoted in some of the previous videos. He was the grandfather of Shangguan Wan. And he is probably one of the most representative poets of the early Tang period. We've talked a lot about the early Tang and early Tang poets. Just a brief recap. The first century of the Tang dynasty goes approximately from, let's say, 610 to 715. So basically the 6th century of our era is a period of consolidation and military expansion of the dynasty. Literarily, it is a period in which Tang poetry is basically just a continuation of the poetry of the period of disunion. The main style is court poetry, which is very aristocratic, polished, rather superficial sort of poetry that's mainly composed on courtly topics, on courtly commands, and it's this sort of like beautiful courtier's grace that any polished aristocrat is supposed to be able to compose. So Shangguan, he gets a very small chapter in Owen's The Early Tang. Is a poet of the reign of Taizong. The first emperor, Li Shimin, is Emperor Gaozu, doesn't spend a lot of time in the throne. He is succeeded by his very able son, who becomes Emperor Taizong, probably the greatest or one of the greatest of all Tang Dynasty emperors. He's also very successful as a military commander, expanding Tang territory and getting the Turks under the Chinese boot. And it's serving Emperor Taizong, when Shangguan becomes an important figure. He was famed for his literary talents. He climbs up in the civil service. He passed the examinations also. The Jinshi examination in the 7th century was still not what it would become in the 8th century as the most prestigious and main avenue to courtly placements. But anyway, Shangguan did pass the exams and held different important posts at court. And he was frequently invited to banquets with Taizong and made many draft versions of the emperor's texts. When Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son, came to the throne, well, his fortunes took a turn for the worse because Gaozong is known as an emperor who was pretty weak, ill most of the time, not very strong, and he was under the thumb of one of his concubines, soon to become empress, Wu Zetian, who had, a few years after the death of her husband, would usurp the imperial throne and proclaim herself empress in her own right. And it was because of his opposition, of Shangguan opposition against Wu Zetian's influence, that he was falsely accused and executed. Okay, so having made this brief perspective of Shangguan political career, which was rather successful, but illustrates how dangerous it is to be in the high echelons of power, let's go back to this poem. So from the title, you can see that it's the very, 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 very typical court poem. Lots of these poems are composed by imperial command. There is some event, some outing, or ceremony or celebration or banquet at court, and the emperor commands some of his best courtiers and poets to compose an extempore poem celebrating the occasions. Lots of this early Tang poetry are of this sort, poems composed when visiting villas or at outings, which means they have to be composed on the spot which goes partly to explain how this poetry can be so very formulaic and straightforward in some ways. It has to be poetry that can be relatively easily composed, but also why it's so thematically restricted, why it's so controlled by ideas of decorum, of proper diction, of always a positive celebratory mood. It's poetry for celebrating happy imperial occasions, and this poem is no exception. So this poem was written in early spring in the Guiling Hall. The Guiling Hall would have been one of the palaces, one of the structures of the imperial palace. We say imperial palace, but the imperial palace is more like an imperial city. There was a complex of lots of pavilions for the bureaucracy and for the emperor, different main halls of state with different degrees of intimacy, and then in the back, well, areas for imperial recreation. I'm not completely sure where the Guiling Hall was, but the reference to the Taije pond in the second line would seem to point towards the Daming Palace. Like the first imperial palace in Chang'an was the Taichi Palace complex, which was just on the north of the city and which had already been constructed under the Shui dynasty. But it was in a damp and low area, which means the second emperor, Taizong, started works in the northeast of the city to construct a completely new and expansive palatial complex, which would become the Daming Palace, and that for most of the dynasty was the imperial palace, the area where the emperors dwelt. So I've been looking at a few maps. I didn't see any Guiling Hall, but anyway, it would have been probably one of the minor halls of the imperial palace where the emperor enjoyed himself in recreational activities. And again, from the second line, it would have been close to the Taije Pond, which was like this big pond on the north of the palatial complex of the Daming Palace. It was a big lake with pagodas and birds, a nice sightseeing place where emperors would go for their enjoyment, and was part of the most secluded and private area of the imperial palace. So the topic of this poem is, just describing this outing, and it's very sorry. It's very formulaic in some ways and very characteristic of what would become known as the Shangguan style, the Shangguan tea, which he described in lots of books that he wrote, like The Ornamented Ridge Pole, and he codified things on composing poetry formally, like the 8 steps and the 8 maladies to be avoided when composing a regulated poem. In fact, regulated poetry comes from this sort of milieu of court poetry that is really formally regulated and polished. Not many poems, by the way, of Shangguanji have survived. I think only 20, says the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati. So this poem, let's go back to it. It basically just describes a nice outing in early spring. The emperor has some free time, presumably. So he goes in the morning to this beautiful pavilion or palatial building next to the Taije Pond with musicians. They have fun. They enjoy the pleasures of an imperial outing. And at the end of the day, they come back home. The topic of early spring is mixed with the topic of imperial outing. And early spring is a very conventional topic in Chinese poetry in general, but all the more so in early Tang poetry. These poems, usually the early Tang poems, I think Owen mentions that they generally have this sort of tripartite structure. They have like a first couplet that introduces the topic, then the most of the poem and the next parts, which are usually the parallelistic couplets, form the imagistic amplification. That is, they take the topic that was formulated in the title and introduced in the first couplet, and they expand it with parallelistic and beautiful, well-crafted images. And then there's a conclusion. The last couplet, usually conclusions in early Tang poetry, try to be witty and elegant, and they're not just or not always, just emotional outbursts, which is a typical way of finishing a poem before the Six Dynasties. And it still appears in many Tang poems itself. But, they try to make a more reflective, more refined ending. A very typical structure for poems on outings, on celebrations, is the passage of the day. And we have this in this poem. Like the poem begins in the morning, and events happen, and the poem concludes at the end of the day. So there's this, the end of the poem is the end of the festivity, is the end of the day, is the end of the revels. So it has this quasi-cosmic structure embroidered within. And also, as you shall see, all the languages, celebratory, celebratory and beautiful and fresh, and it's meant to showcase an ambience of magnificence and splendor, the refreshing atmosphere of early spring conjoined with the beautiful, joyous atmosphere of a court party. Okay, without further ado, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. In form, it looks like a regulated poem, like a standard one. It's pentasyllabic lines, 8 lines, and the 2 middle couplets look, in the translation, parallel couplets. Well, at least lexically, they seem like parallelistic couplets. First couplet. A sedan chair emerges from the Pixiang Palace. A clear song draws near to the Taiye Pond. So you can see even the first couplet feels parallelistic. Yeah? Sedan chair, clear song. Emerge, draw. From, near. Pixiang Palace, Taiye Pond. So parallelism is heavily relied on. So as we said, the first couplet sets the scene. Very, very court poetry-esque. We don't get the emperor himself. So the emperor comes. The first couplet is the emperor comes to this place of enjoyment and of this palatial pavilion of splendor and beauty and with a lake. The emperor comes, but the emperor isn't explicitly mentioned. Like we have a sedan chair, so this is metonymy. The emperor would be inside that palanquin or chair being carried. And the clear song that draws near to the pond would have been the songs of the female entertainers that go along with the emperor as part of his retinue. So through these visual and oral images, we get the emperor coming to the Pixiang Palace near to the Taiye Pond. So in the inner precincts of the imperial palace, where the emperor mostly enjoys a degree of privacy and where he entertains himself. And, the clear song implies the musicians, implies the entertainment. Interesting, the poem was, if you remember the title, Early Spring in the Guiling Hall. But here we mentioned the Pixiang Palace. And this is worth mentioning. It was a general stylistic trope to refer to buildings of the imperial palace in the Tang dynasty with the names of equivalent buildings from the Han dynasty. This especially happens in historical poems for making veiled historical criticism of the present. I mean, Confucian poets are expected to criticize contemporary mistakes, but they can't do it too directly because that's treason or insubordination. So one of the tricks is that historical poems generally are meant to be read as criticism of the present by finding some past parallelism that can be read as taking place again in the present. And the Tang poets tended to connect their own dynasty a lot with the Han because, well, the Han was the most prestigious of the imperial dynasties until the Tang came along. And, even though that was accidental, this became quite a reasonable parallelism from our perspective because both the Han and the Tang are the high watermarks of ancient Chinese dynasties. But anyway, here this trope of giving the names of, in this case, not Han historical figures, but yes, of Han historical constructions instead of the modern name, in the court poetry is just an elegant, indirect way of referring to and connecting with the past. So no Pixiang Palace, it would be the Guiling Hall, but the old Han building gets referenced here. Okay, second couplet. So remember, the second and the third couplets are going to amplify the topic early spring and imperial outing by describing probably the things that can be seen and enjoyed in this pavilion next to the Taya pool, which will be mostly nature sites. Second couplet. Morning trees are filled with warbling orioles. Spring banks are strewn with fragrant grasses. So again, the sites of spring. So we have morning trees and spring banks. Morning trees. So the morning indicates that indicates the part of the day, which is not trivial because, as we said before, the poem ends with the end of the day. So the outing starts now in the morning. We have these trees and an oral image. The birds are singing. So it's spring. The birds are singing. The second line of the couplet brings an aromatic image. So you have these spring banks. It's spring. We said early spring from the title, but here is probably the first explicit reference to spring with a character. So the spring banks are strewn with fragrant grasses. So fragrant, they smell nice. So you have these two positive pleasures for the senses of sound and smell. And you have this abundance also conveyed. Yeah, there's the trees are filled with orioles, the banks are strewn with these fragrant grasses. So these lovely sense awakeners of spring are all around us. Second couplet, the second, sorry, not the second, is the third couplet. Now the third couplet continues with this description, but it moves to the sense of sight. The scenery reflected in the luster of the dewdrops. Petals of snow rise up to the azure void. So again, look at the craftiness. The scenery is viewed, but it's viewed as in a mirror. So like it was spring. Spring is generally associated with dew. So you can imagine that there are thick dewdrops over the grasses, over the leaves of the trees, maybe on the eaves of the palatial structure. And this beautiful landscape that surrounds the emperor and his cortege is seen as in a mirror reflected in the dewdrops, which are shiny and bright, probably in the early morning or even later, close to midday sun. And they look like jewels, like pearls, shiny. So dewdrops acting as a mirror. And the second line of the couplet, petals of snow rise up to the azure void. The reflecting is probably like more horizontal because it's the surrounding, horizontally expanding landscape and scenery which is reflected in the dewdrops. The petals of snow rising up to the azure void connote a vertical elevation, so it's a very well-made parallelism. And petals of snow rise up to the azure void. I am not sure. I suspect these are not real petals of snow. This is early spring, so snow is sometimes reflected or talked upon or present in early spring poems. But I suspect these are plum blossoms. Plum blossoms definitely in Six Dynasties poetry and also in the Japanese follow-up, the early waka of the Kokinshu. Plum blossoms, which bloom in very early spring when snows are still around, became a conventional trope to associate with snow, like especially with things like elegant confusion, like looking at the petals and imagining you're seeing snow. But you know, you get this juxtaposition of an element of winter with an element of spring, which plausibly could be able to coincide chronologically and spatially. So this is a visual element, and again we get the scenery reflected in the shiny dew, and now we get the petals of snow, almost like snow petals, rising up to the azure void, to the blue sky, which is the other way around. You know, petals fall down. Yeah, not petals, snowflakes fall down. Okay, finally, the last couplet. Colorful butterflies appear without end. The mountain's glow dims with the approaching sunset. So the first line of the concluding couplet just evokes the manifold and colorful beauties. We've seen some of them, but you know, this image of colorful butterflies appearing endlessly, you know, it can easily be associated with perhaps with the courtiers themselves or the entertainers wearing flashy, colorful gowns. But you know, it can also be interpreted literally. You have these butterflies going around, and more extensively as a summary for all the beauties, for all the pleasures, all the sights enjoyed in the party. But everything must come to an end, and that's what the last line takes us towards. The mountains glow dims with the approaching sunset. Remember, in the third line we had morning trees. Now in the last line we have a sunset. The mountains glow dims. The sun is setting. The colors become more subdued. We get a still and dark panoramic view of the mountains. The day draws to an end following the natural flow of events. So, this is a very good, very representative poem of the early Tang style.